The forest was so quiet that I could hear my own heartbeat, and then, beneath it, footsteps that weren't mine. I drove into the Willamette National Forest just before dusk, the sky a dull orange bleeding into a deepening blue. The narrow road curved endlessly through the trees, pines crowding the shoulders until it felt like the forest was closing in on me. My plan was simple: park the RV near one of the less used campgrounds, fish the river, and spend 2 nights alone in the quiet. I'd done this dozens of times before, but this trip, something felt different right from the start. When I pulled into the empty campground, the first thing I noticed was the silence. No other vehicles, no voices, just the river whispering somewhere behind the trees. Usually, even the quieter sites had at least 1 or 2 other campers, especially in August, but here, nothing. It should have felt peaceful. Instead, it felt like I was the last person left in the world. I set up quickly, leveling the RV, lighting the little fire pit, and stringing a lantern on the picnic table. The forest pressed in around me, the tree line thick, shadows layered, so deep it looked almost black past the first row of pines. I cooked a simple meal, ate fast, and tried to enjoy the quiet. But the entire time I kept glancing at the tree line. It wasn't one specific sound. It was the lack of sound. No crickets, no owls, just the faint push of the river. My dad used to say silence in the woods meant only one thing: a predator nearby, mountain lion, bear, something hunting. When darkness finally fell, the lantern barely carved a circle around my camp. I grabbed a flashlight and walked to the river, maybe 50 yards through a narrow trail. The air was cold there, the water catching the lantern glow in flashes through the trees. I crouched to fill a bottle, and that's when I heard it. A single crack of a branch, not behind me, not across the river, not across somewhere down the trail I had just walked. I froze, water dripping from the bottle into the dirt. I told myself it was a deer, maybe even an elk. But the rhythm was wrong, not the cautious shuffle of hooves. It had weight, deliberate steps. I slowly lifted the flashlight, aiming it down the path. Nothing, just the tunnel of trees, black and endless. I forced a laugh under my breath and muttered, "Probably just a raccoon." But when I turned back toward camp, I could have sworn I saw movement, something slipping behind a tree. I walked fast back to camp, my chest tight, telling myself I was imagining it. But the silence had changed. Before, it was just still. Now, it was watching. Back at the RV, I locked the door immediately. It felt ridiculous, like hiding from nothing, but the lock gave me a little comfort. I sat by the window for almost an hour, staring out at the glow of the dying fire. My mind kept replaying that single branch snap. Eventually, exhaustion got me. I crawled into the bunk, left the lantern burning low outside, and shut my eyes. Don't know how long I'd been asleep when I woke up, but the RV was dark. The lantern outside had gone out. For a second, I thought that was what woke me. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Not far. Right outside the RV. Slow. Careful. Crunching the dirt. Circling. I held my breath. My entire body locked in place. Every instinct screamed not to move, not to make a sound. I prayed it was just an animal, but deep down I knew better. The steps paused by the side window. I didn't look. I couldn't. I just stared up at the ceiling, listening as the faint scrape of something brushed against the thin wall of the RV. Fingers? A hand sliding along the metal? Then silence again. I waited. My heartbeat was so loud I swore whoever was out there could hear it. Minutes dragged by. I finally reached down, as slow as I could, and grabbed the hunting knife I kept by the bunk. I clenched it tight, blade trembling in my sweaty hand. I must have lain awake like that for hours. When I finally opened my eyes again, pale gray light was leaking through the blinds. Morning. Somehow I'd drifted off despite the fear. I eased to the door, knife still in hand, and unlocked it. The forest was damp, mist curling through the trees. Everything looked normal at first, but when I stepped around the RV, I froze. Footprints. Clear, Human prints in the dirt. Not boots, bare feet. Long, narrow, each toe pressed deep into the soil. They circled the RV, overlapping, pacing as if whoever or whatever it was had walked around and around all night. My stomach dropped. I scanned the tree line, half expecting to see someone standing there. Nothing. Just mist and endless trees. Should have packed up right then, but part of me wanted proof I wasn't losing my mind. I followed the prints a little way down the trail. They wandered, doubled back, then veered off into the forest where the ferns grew thick. That's when I noticed the marks on the trees. Scratches, long and shallow, maybe made with a rock or a knife. Not random, deliberate slashes, angled downward, every few yards along the path. A trail marker, and it led straight toward the river. I stopped. My gut twisted so hard I almost turned and ran. But curiosity pulled me a few more steps. That's when I saw it. A shirt, an old filthy flannel shirt hanging from a low branch. Sleeves, torn. The fabric stiff with dirt and something darker. It swayed slightly as if it had just been placed there. I backed up fast, nearly tripping over a root, my knife still in my hand. Every sound of the forest seemed too loud now, the drip of water from leaves, the far-off caw of a crow. And then, a whistle. Faint, almost playful, from deep in the trees. I didn't wait. I sprinted back to camp, heart hammering. I didn't care about the fire pit, the lantern, anything. I shoved everything into the RV, slammed the door, and gunned the engine. Gravel sprayed as I tore out of the sight, branches scraping the sides as I floored it down the narrow road. Only when I hit the main highway did I finally slow down. My hands shook so bad I could barely keep the wheel straight. I didn't look back, not once. That was 3 years ago. I've camped since then, but never alone. And never in Oregon. Because sometimes, late at night, when the world goes quiet, I swear I can still hear it. The faint, careful footsteps circling in the dark. The lake looked calm, but the silence around it felt wrong, like something was waiting beneath the trees. I drove up to Crater Lake on a late September afternoon, chasing one last camping trip before the weather turned too cold. The air was already sharp, the kind of cold that bites when the sun drops behind the ridges. Crater Lake always felt otherworldly, the water so blue it looked unreal, the caldera walls rising like a fortress around it. Tourists usually crowded the overlook points during summer, but by this time of year the place was thinning out. I found a primitive site off a dirt road a few miles from the rim, completely empty. That's what I wanted. Quiet. Just me, the lake, and 2 nights to reset. I parked the truck, set up a small tent, and collected enough wood for the fire. As the sun dropped, the shadows stretched long between the pines. The forest here felt different than others I'd camped in. Too still, too wide, like the trees were spaced deliberately to watch whoever wandered through. After dinner, I walked the short trail to the lake. The water glowed under the last light, perfectly flat, perfectly silent. No birds skimming the surface, no ripple of fish, just the reflection of the sky, cold and endless. That's when I noticed the post. A weathered wooden post sticking out of the ground near the shore, waist-high, carved with something rough. I crouched closer, ran my hand across the grooves. Letters. Not fresh, but not ancient either. Stay away. I swallowed hard. It didn't look like an official marker, more like someone had hacked it with a knife. The lake felt suddenly colder, turned fast, scanning the tree line, half expecting someone to be standing there watching me. Nothing. Just the whisper of wind across the rim. I went back to camp, uneasy. The fire helped a little. Flames snapping, smoke drifting upward into the black. I sat close, staring into the light until my eyes stung. Every so often, I thought I heard movement, something brushing against the undergrowth just beyond the fire's reach. But when I turned the flashlight that way, nothing was there. I told myself it was just animals, plenty of deer and small critters around here. Still, I kept the hatchet within reach when I finally crawled into my tent. Sometime after midnight, I woke. At first I didn't know why. Then I heard it, a splash, not small, not like a fish jumping. A heavy, deliberate splash from the direction of the lake. I held my breath, straining to hear. The forest was dead silent. Then another splash. Closer this time, as if whatever had entered the water was moving toward shore. I unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. The fire had burned to embers, casting little more than a red glow. The path to the lake was nothing but black. And then, a whistle. Soft. Off-key. Coming from the direction of the water. My stomach knotted. I zipped the tent back up, heart racing. Who the hell whistles at 1 a.m. on a deserted lake? The sound carried through the trees, slow and steady, almost mocking. It circled, echoing strangely, until it seemed to come from behind my tent. I gripped the hatchet so tight my hand ached. The whistling stopped, and for the longest time there was only silence. At dawn I stumbled out of the tent, exhausted, nerves shredded. The fire pit was cold. The forest looked normal again. But when I walked down to the lake, my blood turned to ice. The post was gone, the one carved with "Stay away." Just a raw stump remained where it had been, but something else was there, half buried in the wet sand. A boot, old, waterlogged, torn along the seams. Not mine. I nudged it with the hatchet and water seeped out. Inside, something dark clung to the sole. Hair, maybe. I backed away fast, scanning. The trees, my pulse hammering. That's when I saw the footprints. Not boot prints. Bare feet again. Long, deep, pressed into the mud, leading from the water's edge straight toward the trail, straight toward my camp. I didn't stay to investigate. I tore my camp down in minutes, shoving everything into the truck. As I pulled onto the dirt road, I checked the rearview mirror. Through the dust, just for a second, I thought I saw a figure at the tree line. Tall, still, watching. I blinked, and it was gone. It's been months now, but every time I think of Crater Lake, I don't remember the water or the ridges or the view. I remember the sound of that whistle, drifting through the trees. I knew I wasn't the only one on the trail when I found the second set of footprints, bare feet pressed into the snow. I drove east from Portland in early October, chasing the last clear weekend before winter storms locked Mount Hood under ice. The mountain rose sharp against the sky, its peak already powdered white, the lower slopes dressed in dark evergreens. I wanted solitude. Just me, my pack, and the timberline trail that circled the mountain. The parking lot at the trailhead was half empty, a surprise for this time of year. I strapped on my pack, checked the map, and started up the trail. The air was crisp, the forest quiet except for the occasional creak of branches. Hiking alone never bothered me before, but that first mile felt strange. I kept glancing back, half expecting someone to be behind me. Nothing, just trees stretching, endless and still. Around dusk, I stopped at a flat spot near a creek. I pitched the tent, lit the little stove, and boiled water for noodles. The sound of the creek was steady, but beneath it I thought I heard something else, like faint steps crunching leaves in rhythm with mine earlier. I told myself it was just the echo of memory. The forest closed in fast with the sunset. One moment it was golden, the next it was black. I crawled into the tent, zipped the bag, and let exhaustion drag me under. I woke in the night to silence so complete it was suffocating. Not even the creek. And then I heard it. A cough. Faint. Human. Just beyond the thin nylon walls of my tent. I froze, breath caught in my throat. The sound came again. Low, wet, like someone clearing their throat after a long silence. I gripped the knife from my pack and stayed still for what felt like an hour. Finally, exhaustion pulled me back under. Morning came gray and cold. I unzipped the tent and stepped out. Nothing looked unusual. No prints, no broken branches. I tried to shake it off as a dream, but the unease clung to me. I hiked on, higher, into the wilderness. Patches of snow lingered on the shaded slopes, crunching under my boots. That's when I saw them. Footprints. At first I thought they were another hiker's, but they weren't boots. Bare feet. Long, narrow, each step sunk deep into the crust of snow. They weren't old either. The edges were sharp, fresh. My stomach twisted. Who hikes barefoot in October on Mount Hood? I followed them without meaning to, eyes locked, heart racing. They led off the trail, weaving between trees, doubling back as if whoever made them had been circling, watching. I stopped when I saw the tree. Carved into the bark, crude and deep, were words, "Not alone." The letters oozed sap, still wet. Stumbled back, nearly slipping on the snow. My throat went dry. That's when I heard it again. The cough. Close this time. I spun, knife out, scanning the trees. Nothing. Just the endless black trunks stretching up the slope. I backed away fast, heart slamming until I found the trail again. I didn't stop moving until I made camp miles farther. That night the wind picked up, rattling the tent. I tried to convince myself it was only the wind when I heard the flap tugged from the outside. But then came the whistle. Low, off-key, circling the tent. I held the knife, shaking, whispering to myself that it was just my mind playing tricks. Then something pressed against the side of the tent. A hand, fingers spread wide, dragging slowly down the nylon until they slipped away. I didn't sleep. At dawn, I packed fast, ignoring the ache in my legs. The trail twisted down toward the tree line, but I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on me. When I reached the lot, relief hit hard, until I saw my truck. Mud smeared across the driver's side window. 4 long streaks, finger marks, and in the center of the glass, a single word traced through the grime. Stay. I drove off without looking back, hands shaking the wheel. Even now, when I close my eyes, I can still hear it. The cough echoing through the trees, wet and low, waiting. I thought I knew every sound the forest made, until I heard breathing that wasn't my own. I had been planning this solo trip along the Rogue River Trail for months. Oregon in late September was perfect. Crisp air, fewer hikers, and the river running clear and fast. I parked my old SUV at the trailhead just as the sun dropped behind the hills, casting long shadows across the water. My pack was heavy with essentials, but I didn't care. This was meant to be peaceful. The trail followed the river closely, and first winding through thick groves of alder and cedar. Leaves rustled with every gust of wind, and the smell of wet earth hung heavy in the air. I moved carefully, keeping to the path, enjoying the rhythmic crunch of my boots on fallen leaves. I set up camp after a few miles, in a small clearing on a bluff overlooking a bend in the river. The spot was perfect. Clear sight lines in all directions, easy access to water, and no one else around. I started a small fire and watched the water sparkle in the fading sunlight. As darkness fell, I noticed how quiet it had become. Not the pleasant quiet of solitude, but the oppressive silence of something holding its breath. No frogs, no insects, no birds. The river's gentle rush was the only sound, but even it felt muffled. I cooked dinner, ate quickly, and went to bed, in my small tent. Outside, the fire smoldered, giving off little warmth. I lay awake for a while, listening, telling myself I was just being paranoid. Then I heard it. A branch snapping. Not close. Not far. Right at the edge of my clearing. I froze, heart hammering. Probably a deer, I whispered to myself, though I didn't believe it. The sound came again, deliberate, slow. I grabbed my flashlight and swung it toward the tree line. The beam caught nothing, but I felt it. Eyes watching. I spent hours staring through the tent mesh, waiting. Nothing. Eventually, exhaustion dragged me under. I woke hours later, suddenly. Something was moving outside. A low rustling dragging along the undergrowth. Didn't move, didn't breathe. My pack knife was in my hand, the only comfort I had. The rustling grew closer, deliberate, methodical. I peeked through the small flap of my tent. A figure, tall, shrouded in shadow. No face visible, just standing there, watching. The river behind it shimmered under moonlight. the trees casting jagged, shifting patterns across its frame. I blinked. When I looked back, it was gone. Morning came reluctantly. I unzipped the tent slowly, half expecting to see the figure still lurking. Nothing. Just forest. Just the river. But then I saw the fire pit. The rocks had been rearranged. A small, crude triangle pointing toward the river. Not there last night, my stomach sank. I tried to brush it off, but unease lingered like a shadow over my shoulder. I spent the day hiking cautiously. Every few minutes I would stop and scan the underbrush. Branches bent unnaturally, footprints in soft mud. Sometimes one, sometimes two. Always bare feet. By evening I decided to camp again near a wider section of the trail, thinking I'd get a better vantage. I set up fast, ate, and tried to convince myself I was being paranoid. The night was colder than the last. Around 2 a.m. I woke to the smell first, smoky, metallic like a fire smoldering close. Then I heard the breathing. Slow, deep. Not human, or maybe too human. I grabbed the knife, sat upright, scanning the darkness outside. The fire had died completely, and the forest was black. And then movement. Something crossing the trail, out of my flashlight's reach. I froze. Every nerve screamed to run, but I couldn't. Then came the softest sound. A whisper, unintelligible, carried by the wind, coming from behind me. I spun to the tent opening. Nothing. Minutes passed. I stayed like that until the first gray light seeped through the trees. When I finally left the site, I tried to shake off the memory, rationalizing it as sleep deprivation or paranoia. But at the trailhead, I froze, scratched into the hood of my SUV. Alone. Fresh. Deep. Wet with sap from a small branch. I didn't check for fingerprints. I didn't look into the woods. I drove away fast, never taking that trail again. Even now, months later, the sound of footsteps in the leaves or a branch snapping behind me in a quiet forest sends me into a panic. And sometimes when I'm alone, I swear I hear a soft whistle echoing from somewhere I can't see. The forest wasn't just quiet. It was waiting like it knew I didn't belong. I had planned a solo backpacking trip into the Three Sisters wilderness for late September, hoping for a few days of solitude before winter crept in. The trailhead was tucked off a narrow logging road, the kind of place that feels forgotten even by locals. I parked my truck, slung the pack over my shoulder, and stepped onto the trail, feeling the crunch of dried pine needles underfoot. The air was crisp, almost biting, and every breath smelled of wet earth and decaying leaves. The trail climbed steadily, winding between tall pines, Douglas firs, and patches of alder. Sunlight pierced through the canopy in narrow shafts, painting the forest floor in spots of gold. I felt alive. Alone, yes, but alive. There's a strange thrill in hiking solo. You notice the smallest things, the flutter of a bird's wing, the distant rumble of a river, the creak of a leaning tree. By late afternoon, I found a clearing beside a small stream, perfect for setting up camp. I pitched my tent, gathered wood, and started a small fire. The water was cold and clear, and I drank deeply, thinking about nothing but the trail, the lake, and the mountain ridges beyond. As dusk approached, the forest changed. Shadows lengthened, deepened, and I realized the silence was different from what I was used to. No animals calling, no insects chirping, just stillness. I brushed it off as normal for this remote area. I ate a quick meal, cleaned up, and crawled into my tent, leaving the fire smoldering. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of something crunching leaves nearby. At first, I thought it was a deer, maybe a small animal wandering too close. But the steps were deliberate, heavy, human. I froze, my heart thumped, adrenaline surging. I unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. Nothing. Then from behind the trees, a whistling sound drifted through the night. Off-key, long, deliberate. It circled my camp, echoing strangely. I gripped my knife so tight my knuckles went white. The whistling stopped. A branch snapped close. I swung the flashlight toward the sound. A figure, tall, shadowed, standing completely still among the trees. I blinked. When I looked back again, it was gone. The next morning, the unease hadn't left me. I packed quickly, determined to keep moving. As I hiked along the stream, I noticed footprints. Barefoot, long, fresh, leading off trail, weaving through ferns, sometimes doubling back. The forest seemed almost alive with intent, guiding me, warning me. I stumbled on, heart hammering. Then, I saw it. A makeshift marker, a stick, sharpened, stuck into the ground with a crude triangle carved into it. The point faced my direction. I swallowed hard. The message was clear. I wasn't welcome. By evening, I reached a ridge with a view of the Three Sisters peaks. I stopped, gasping for air, trying to calm down. But something made me look back. The trees below the ridge shifted unnaturally. Shadows moved in ways that didn't match the wind. And the whistling came again, soft, playful, mocking. I ran, hiked faster than I had in years, adrenaline burning through exhaustion. Every step crunching on dry pine needles sounded like gunfire in my head. When I finally made camp in a small, safer clearing near a creek, I left no trace of my previous stop. I double-checked my tent, tied knots tight, and barely slept. At dawn, I left. I didn't linger, didn't look back. Even miles down the trail, I felt eyes following. My mind raced with thoughts of what, or who had been watching, guiding, waiting. Weeks later, I spoke to another hiker who had camped the same area. "They've been leaving markers," he said casually. "Some say it's just old campers, warning each other. Some say something else watches those trails." I never went back. And I still dream sometimes of the whistling, echoing through the Three Sisters, circling endlessly. The water looked calm, but I knew something was moving beneath the surface, watching me. I had parked my old pickup near the banks of the Deschutes River in late September, hoping for a quiet weekend of camping and fishing. Oregon's river, trails were usually crowded with kayakers and weekend anglers, but this stretch was remote, and by the time I arrived, the only sound was the gentle rush of water over rocks. The river carved a narrow canyon through pine and juniper, cliffs rising on either side. The sun hung low, painting everything in a dim orange glow. I set up my tent on a flat section of sand just above the waterline. The ground was hard-packed but clean, perfect for a small campfire. I unpacked my gear, checked my fishing rod, and wandered along the riverbank. Shadows stretched long in the canyon, and I noticed how eerily quiet the forest was. Not the comforting quiet of solitude, but the tense stillness of a place waiting. After dark, I built a small fire. Sparks floated upward, catching on the low-hanging branches. The river glimmered faintly, reflecting the fire's orange glow. I ate quickly, washed up in the chilly water, and crawled into my tent, leaving a small lantern burning outside. Hours passed before I woke to the sound that made my blood run cold. A splash. Not far from camp. Not random. A deliberate splash, followed by another. I froze, listening. The river seemed to shift, but there was no ripple from the surface. My mind raced. Fish? Maybe, but too regular, too heavy for fish. Then came the whistle. Low, deliberate, coming from the forest above, the riverbank. My stomach twisted. I grabbed my knife and peeked outside. Mist hovered over the water. Nothing visible. The sound of footsteps crunching leaves came from upstream, careful, slow. Bare feet, no boots. I stayed motionless, heart hammering. The footsteps stopped just out of sight. Silence returned. I waited. Minutes, hours it felt. By dawn, the lantern had burned out. I emerged from my tent cautiously. The river looked calm again, but that sense of being watched didn't leave. I checked the banks. Footprints. Barefoot. Leading upstream, circling my campsite, then vanishing into the dense underbrush. I packed quickly and moved along the river, keeping my eyes constantly scanning. Every rustle of leaves, every shadow in the trees set my nerves on edge. Then I noticed the trees along the bank. Scratches. Deep angled marks on the bark. A message crude but clear. "Leave now." I swallowed hard, adrenaline spiking. The scratches repeated along the bank, a line pointing downstream. Whoever, or whatever made them was guiding me, or warning me. Night fell again as I tried to find another campsite. I kept a small fire going, listening. The river's gentle rush barely masked the subtle sounds around me. Distant branches snapping, soft footsteps weaving through the undergrowth, the faint whistle that seemed closer every hour. At one point, I caught movement along the cliff edge, above. Tall, dark silhouette, perfectly still. I held my breath. Blinked. Nothing. By midnight, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my gear, the fire barely aglow, and left on foot, moving downstream along the river trail. My flashlight bobbed as I ran, trying to stay on the narrow trail. Every step I felt like something was following, staying just out of view. When I finally reached a bridge crossing the river at first light, I paused, heart pounding. The forest behind me was silent again, but something had changed. Along the sand and dirt, the bare footprints circled my path, leading upstream again, then disappearing abruptly at the water's edge. I didn't stop to look back. I crossed the bridge, my legs burning, my hands shaking. I drove home without glancing at the river again. Weeks later, I told a friend about the trip. "Deschutes can be quiet." "Too quiet," he said. "Some people report seeing shadows along the river at night, barefoot, following. You weren't imagining it. Even now, I avoid rivers after dark. But when I do, I swear I hear that soft whistle, drifting along the water, reminding me I was never alone." I thought I was alone in the forest until I heard footsteps that mirrored mine. I had driven south from Eugene, aiming for a weekend alone in the Umpqua National Forest. Oregon's coast had been rainy, but this inland forest promised a crisp, dry escape. The winding road narrowed as I approached the trailhead, lined with towering Douglas firs and thick underbrush. I parked the SUV, checked my pack, and stepped onto the trail, immediately feeling the weight of solitude pressing in. The forest smelled damp and earthy, with patches of fallen needles and moss-covered rocks along the path. Every footstep echoed, softly in the stillness. I usually loved hiking alone, but there was something different here. The forest felt patient, like it was watching me adjust to its rhythms. By mid-afternoon, I reached a small clearing near a creek, perfect for my campsite. I pitched the tent, collected firewood, and boiled water for dinner. The creek bubbled quietly, and I noticed the way the shadows stretched between trees, moving slightly with the breeze. Something about it unsettled me, though I couldn't say why. As night fell, I set up a small campfire, its glow throwing flickering patterns on the surrounding trees. The forest was silent. No owls, no insects, no rustling except for the creek. I crawled into the tent early, trying to relax, though unease lingered like a cold hand on my shoulder. Around midnight, I woke to a soft crunching sound outside. My heart thumped. I listened carefully. The sound repeated, deliberate as if someone was pacing around my campsite. I gripped the knife from my pack. Every instinct screamed not to move, not to make a sound. A shadow moved across the tent flap. Slow, purposeful. I held my breath. Then the sound of breathing, low, wet, close. I didn't dare peek. I stayed frozen for what felt like hours, sweat running cold down my back. Morning arrived with gray light filtering through the trees. I unzipped the tent cautiously. Nothing seemed out of place. The fire pit was intact, and the campsite looked undisturbed, but as I stepped onto the trail, I noticed footprints, bare feet, long, narrow, pressed deep into the soft earth. And they weren't leading away. They mirrored my own path. Whoever had been there had been circling the campsite, watching me, pacing in the dark. My stomach turned. I hurried down the trail, keeping my eyes on the shadows. Branches snapped somewhere behind me. I stopped. Nothing. Then movement again. By late afternoon, I reached a river bend. I paused to rest, heart still racing. That's when I noticed tree markings, shallow carvings along, several trunks angled downward as if pointing the way. One even had letters, alone. The word made my blood run cold. I wasn't alone. Not really. The sun dipped lower, and I knew I wouldn't be able to leave the forest before dark. I set up camp again in a safer clearing closer to the river. The fire barely lit the area, but I couldn't let my guard down. Every shadow could hide something, or someone. In the middle of the night, the whispers started, soft, incoherent, drifting through the pines. I sat upright, knife trembling, then footsteps, bare feet, slow, pacing, circling my campfire. I barely dared to breathe. Then something pressed against the tent wall. Fingers, scraping, slow, deliberate. I froze. Minutes later, it vanished. At dawn, I packed quickly and moved out. I didn't stop for water, didn't linger for breakfast. As I reached the parking lot, I glanced back. Mud streaks on my truck, 4 deep smears across the side door, and a message scrawled in dirt and sap. Leave. I never returned to Umpqua. Even now, the sound of leaves crunching in an empty forest sends my heart racing. And sometimes, far from Oregon, I swear I hear the soft echo of footsteps pacing just out of view. I thought the mountain was empty, until I heard the footsteps following me up the ridge. I drove to the Wallowa Mountains in early October, chasing the last weekend of clear weather before snow set in. The peaks rose jagged against the sky, their ridges already dusted with white. I had my pack ready, filled with essentials for a 2-day solo hike. My goal was simple: summit a small ridge, camp near the lake, and enjoy complete solitude. The trail started through dense pine forests, moss covering the ground in thick green mats. Sunlight barely pierced the canopy, making the forest floor shadowed and uneven. Every step crunched on dead needles and small branches. The silence was heavy, the kind of quiet that presses on your chest and makes your ears ring. By afternoon, I reached a small alpine meadow overlooking a glacier-fed lake. The view was stunning, water so clear it mirrored the sky perfectly. I pitched my tent near the tree line, gathered wood and started a small fire. Everything felt perfect, until the silence pressed in. I noticed how the forest around me didn't just feel quiet. It watched. The slightest sound I made seemed to echo unnaturally. Birds avoided this area. Even squirrels were absent. It was like the mountain itself was holding its breath. Night fell quickly. I crawled into my tent after a quick meal, leaving a small lantern burning. Hours passed. The wind picked up, rattling the tent fabric. That's when I heard it. Footsteps. Not far, just outside the tent. Slow, heavy, deliberate. My heart stopped. I gripped the knife from my pack, frozen in place. The footsteps circled, echoing against the mountain slope. Then silence. Minutes passed. I dared not move, listening as the forest resumed its muted breathing. My adrenaline buzzed, keeping me wide awake. At first light, I emerged cautiously. The lake shimmered peacefully, the meadow bathed in pale gold. I should have felt relief, but the footprints told another story. Bare feet pressed deep into the soft soil circling my tent. Long, narrow steps, leading nowhere and everywhere at once. I followed the prints down the ridge briefly, just to see where they led. They veered back into the forest and disappeared. But there were scratches on nearby trees, shallow cuts in the bark, angled downward like a warning. One tree had letters carved roughly into the trunk. Alone is danger. I swallowed hard. I tried to hike farther along the ridge to distract myself. The mountain was stunning during the day. Glaciers, jagged peaks, alpine meadows, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig sent my nerves screaming. By evening, I returned to camp. The fire glowed faintly and I tried to sleep. But a soft whistle drifted through the tree line. Low, off-key, circling. My knife was ready. I sat awake for hours listening. Then the fabric of the tent shifted. Something pressed against it, fingers dragging slowly along the nylon. I didn't dare move. I thought the waterfalls would soothe me, but the forest around them whispered secrets I wasn't meant to hear. I arrived at Silver Falls State Park in early October, hoping for a weekend of hiking and photography. The park is famous for its waterfalls, each tumbling into deep pools surrounded by mossy cliffs. But I was seeking solitude, so I took the less-traveled canyon trail winding through dense forest away from the crowds. The trail was littered with leaves and small branches, muffling the sound of my boots. The air was damp, carrying the scent of wet moss and decaying wood. Every so often I'd catch the distant roar of a waterfall, but closer, the forest was silent, unnaturally so. I found a small clearing beside a slow creek, perfect for pitching my tent. I set up quickly, collected firewood, and boiled water for dinner. The forest felt alive in a way that was both beautiful and oppressive. The shadows stretched unnaturally, branches scraping softly against one another as though whispering. Night fell. I crawled into my tent after a small fire, listening to the creek and the distant rush of water. But soon the silence was broken by something else. A soft tap, 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 like sticks being knocked together just outside the tent. I froze, straining to hear. The sound repeated, moving in a deliberate pattern, circling the tent. My heart thumped. I grabbed the knife from my pack, barely breathing. Then a low whistle, barely audible, drifted through the trees. Slow, deliberate, circling. I didn't sleep. Every crackle of the fire, every rustle in the underbrush set my nerves on edge. At one point I peeked outside the tent, flashlight ready. Shadows stretched far across the forest floor. Something or someone moved between the trees, careful, silent. I blinked. Nothing. The next morning, I ventured closer to the waterfall. The view was breathtaking, but something was off. The ground near the base had footprints. Bare feet. Long, deep impressions leading back into the forest, circling around the pools and rocks. I swallowed hard. I wasn't alone. I hiked cautiously, keeping an eye on the underbrush. Branches snapped, leaves rustled, but every time I looked, nothing moved. Until I reached a small footbridge crossing a creek. On the railing, carved roughly into the wood, "Turn back." The message made my stomach knot. Someone or something had been following me, guiding me, warning me. I didn't linger. I hiked for miles, trying to shake the feeling. But the forest followed me in memory. The whistle, the bare footprints, the taps on the tent. By nightfall, I set up another camp near a quiet bend of the trail. I kept the fire alive, the knife in hand. Around midnight, I heard the whispering again, closer this time. Steps outside the tent, circling, deliberate. I could hear breathing. Then the soft pressure of something pressing against the tent wall. Stayed frozen until the first light of dawn, never closing my eyes. At the trailhead the next morning, relief washed over me, but only for a moment. Scratched into my SUV's rear panel deep enough to draw sap, never alone. I didn't look back. I drove off, stomach churning, adrenaline still thrumming. Even months later, I avoid the park. But the memory lingers. The sound of whistling, footsteps, and bare feet circling just out of sight. I thought the snow would blanket the forest in silence, but something was moving beneath it, watching me. I had planned a late October trip to Santiam Pass, chasing the last bit of accessible wilderness before the winter storms hit Oregon's Cascades. Snow already dusted the higher elevations, and the cold air bit at my cheeks as I parked my SUV near the trailhead. My pack was loaded for an overnight trip: tent, stove, food, and plenty of warm layers. The trail started through thick pine and fir, snow crunching beneath each step. The forest was quiet. Too quiet, but that's what I wanted. Solitude, peace, a chance to disconnect. By mid-afternoon, I found a small clearing near a frozen creek, perfect for camp. I set up my tent, collected firewood, and boiled water for dinner. The snow made everything brighter, reflecting the dim sunlight, but the shadows of the trees stretched long and deep, darkening the edges of my vision. As night fell, the temperature dropped sharply. I crawled into my tent early, trying to rest. Hours passed before I was awakened by a faint scraping sound outside. At first I thought it was a branch moving in the wind, but the pattern was deliberate, slow, circling the tent. I gripped my knife, heart hammering. Then came the whistling, soft, melodic, deliberate, weaving between the trees. It circled my camp. I dared not move, barely breathing, listening to every crackle of the frozen forest. I stayed awake all night watching. At one point I noticed faint depressions in the snow near the tree line, footprints, bare feet. Long, deep stepping carefully. The snow around them was disturbed as if someone, or something, had been pacing for hours. By dawn, I couldn't wait any longer. I packed quickly, leaving minimal trace. But as I moved along the trail, I noticed scratches on tree trunks, deep angled marks, clearly deliberate. Some had letters carved into the bark, watching. I swallowed hard, adrenaline still racing. Whoever or whatever had made these marks had been close, very close. The day passed in tense silence. Every crack of snow, every rustle in the firs made me jump. By evening, I set up camp again near a small ridge. I lit a fire but kept it low, wary of drawing attention. At midnight, the whistling returned. Circling my tent, footsteps pressed into the snow around me. I could hear breathing, and then faintly, a dragging sound, as if something heavy was moving just beyond the firelight. I didn't sleep. Not an hour. Morning came gray and cold. I packed quickly, retracing my steps to the trailhead. Relief washed over me when I saw my SUV. But on the hood, someone or something had written in the snow, "Never alone." I didn't stop to look back. I drove down the mountain, hands white on the wheel. Even now, months later, I can't forget that snow, the footprints, or the sound of whistling circling silently just beyond my vision. Santiam Pass is beautiful, but I will never go back.